The Cold War channel has been publishing episodes for what feels like a long time at this point. Since we first launched in March of 2019, we've covered 10 to 15 years of Cold War history, from the huge topics of the early era, including Potsdam, the Berlin airlift, the death of Stalin, the Chinese Civil War, and the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, to some of the lesser-known topics, including the Hawk Rebellion in the Philippines, the Greek Civil War, the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, and Operation FF in Egypt. So where does that put us now? Well, it puts us in a new studio space, as you can see. This change is going to provide us with more flexibility, more space, and allow us to continue to grow and try new things. And as for the history part, we're moving towards the 1960s and the building of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the American War in Vietnam. Given that, we figured we should give a bit of a summary, tie some things together, and provide some context. So let's get into it. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. Let's start by talking a little bit about dates. When talking about the Cold War timeline, it's often widely accepted that the starting date was 1947. By then, it was very apparent that the wartime alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was dead and gone, and a new era of global tension had set in. But this channel deliberately started with the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. The roots of the Cold War very firmly took hold there. A divided Germany under separate zones of occupation was accepted as the way forward. Soviet domination of the Eastern and Central European countries it had liberated from Nazi Germany was accepted, even though transition plans to democratic governance were agreed on, no matter how ill-fated. It was at Potsdam that American nuclear capability was revealed to the Soviets, even if Stalin already knew about it. Potsdam formed the division lines that would separate red from blue for the next half-century. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 gave an international forum for disputes and grievances to be discussed, debated, and for those deemed in the wrong, chastised. However, the imposed necessity of the Security Council and its permanent member nations' crucial veto votes meant that the overall effectiveness of the organization was hampered from the outset. Instead of a body that could help mediate and overcome global conflict, the United Nations was to become just another battleground of the Cold War. The Middle East saw a new nation emerge in 1947. The State of Israel was carved from British Palestine, immediately creating a deep and deeply destabilizing conflict in the region. As the Cold War progresses, the unsettled nature of the Middle East region will forge new alliances and forge international friendships where none had ever existed before. By 1948, the Sovietization of the countries behind the Iron Curtain was well underway. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and even tiny Albania were being dominated by communists in government, either by questionable electoral means or by outright coup. Moscow, devastated by the German invasion of 1941, decided that it needed the buffer states of Europe to prevent such a calamity from happening again. Future wars wouldn't be fought on Soviet soil, so the thinking went, so borders on maps were redrawn and huge numbers of people were forced to relocate so that ethnicities matched borders on those maps. As the Soviet Union tightened its grip over its new socialist brothers, they saw in occupied Berlin the opportunity to test the mettle of the Allies, who they didn't think would have the ability or even desire to stand up to the Soviet Union. The Berlin airlift clearly demonstrated the resolve of the Western Allies that they would not let Soviet influence spread farther without putting up a fight. This led to the Truman Doctrine and its theories of containment, a set of policies that would see the United States begin to involve itself militarily and politically on a global scale. Now, despite this commitment to halting the spread of communism, 1949 saw the triumph of Mao in China and the establishment of the People's Republic there. Communism really did seem ascendant. The same year saw the Soviet Union join the nuclear club, ending American hegemony over atomic weapons. Suddenly, and much faster than expected, the Soviets had access to weapons that could wreak havoc and destruction in the flash of an atom. What was sparked from this was an ever-escalating quest on both sides of the Iron Curtain to build more, bigger, and more destructive weapons of war, as well as the tools to try and thwart them. The arms industries on both sides of the conflict were working overtime, churning out jets, tanks, submarines, missiles, and rockets, all with the stated intent of defending their nations from the imminent attack expected from the other side. That attack actually came in 1950, but not in Europe as expected, but rather when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, sparking the Korean War. It's notable how seriously the use of nuclear weapons was considered, but ultimately deemed too much of a risk of causing a global calamity. 3 years of fighting eventually ended, the stalemate transforming itself into a de facto peace. But that didn't mean that planning for war was suspended. Alliances were formed on both sides. NATO in the West, a defensive alliance born from the wartime alliance, but with a clear and stated mission of standing up to the Soviet Union. On the other side, the Warsaw Pact was formed, not only as a counterweight to NATO, but also to help the USSR maintain its own dominance over its European satellites. When Stalin died in 1953, the wheels of change were set in motion. The hardline authoritarianism sponsored by Stalin began to fall to the wayside as Khrushchev consolidated his power and tried to liberalize somewhat. Well, at home anyway. While the thaw took hold inside the Soviet Union, bringing with it a flurry of internal criticism, the same tried to happen outside of the Soviet Union as well. Uprisings in both Poland and Hungary were put down, one far more brutally than the other, laying bare the authoritarian nature of the Soviet Union for the world to see. Despite this, Moscow still hoped for some form of rapprochement with the West. Communist China, unhappy with this deviation from the path of global revolution, began to pull away from the Soviet Union, pursuing its own independent global revolution. The British Empire, its power and resources stripped bare and bled dry in the exertions of the Second World War, began the process of dismantling itself. The independence of India immediately turned into a conflict as the nations of India and Pakistan emerged, with ever-deepening enmity between them. The United Kingdom, despite the introduction of many socialist policies at home, such as the NHS, found itself fighting against communist and ethnic insurgency in its empire. In both Malaya and in Kenya, although British forces won the battle, they would go on to lose the war as independence was achieved. The United Kingdom's low point came in 1956, when it found itself unsupported by its own ally during a British attempt to maintain power and influence in the Suez. Washington, for its part, dedicated to halting the spread of communism, was pursuing a policy that can best be surmised as the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Through both covert and overt mechanisms, the United States allied itself to, propped up, or simply installed autocratic and repressive governments in countries where it saw the threat of socialism establishing itself. By the early 1950s, the instigator for some of these actions was becoming blurred. In places such as Guatemala and Iran, regime change was pursued not necessarily just to halt the spread of communism, but also to further US and Western business interests. In the same vein, Washington found itself actively working with former Nazis in both the new West Germany as well as its own domestic scientific research programs in order to gain advantage over Moscow. This is a trend that will continue throughout the Cold War period. On both sides of the ideological divide, the impact and role intelligence agencies played became more and more prominent. The formation of the CIA and the NSA began a process of intelligence operations and covert actions that would spiral over the coming decades, resulting in some of the craziest stories of the period. Soviet intelligence services, embodied by the KGB and the GRU, grew their influence both domestically and abroad, creating and running some of the world's most successful espionage networks in history. From the Cambridge Five to the Rosenbergs to Aldrich Ames, Soviet intelligence services proved highly effective. The early Cold War in Asia was marked by communist insurgencies. In places such as Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, left-wing movements fought for national independence against colonial governments. Even as early as the 1940s, however, these movements were not strictly ideological in nature. As we've seen, and will go on to see, many of these socialist movements were at their core nationalist movements with ideology bolted onto it. This is yet another trend that will continue throughout the entire period around the globe. So that's a brief recap of where we are. Two sides, opposed to each other, maneuvering and dancing around each other, using other nations as pawns in the game. Marriages of convenience were made by both sides, all in the name of ideological protection. Two sides, both with massive and expanding militaries, ready to go to war with each other, but somewhat restrained by the notion that a war would likely be catastrophic for the entire planet. As we approach our coverage of what was probably the single most tense and dangerous moments of the entire Cold War, we would like to thank you, our viewers, for your continued support. We genuinely couldn't do this without you. I, for one, have learned an immense amount about a time period that I had thought I was already relatively familiar with. I've also had the opportunity to meet with and interact with new people from all over the world, and I and the entire team here at the Cold War appreciate the thoughts and feedback we get from you every day and every week. I would also like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our team of researchers and writers, Ilkin, Tristan, Turgut, Arnaldo, Ryan, Matt, and Lau, as well as our producer extraordinaire, Cameron and Nurlan, without whom no episode would ever get published. As always, financial support is greatly appreciated via PayPal or via Patreon at www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. Patreon support gets you such perks as early access to videos and access to copies of our scripts. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.